Hello guys and welcome to the Physics channel. I'm Rocket and today I'm going to be talking all about evolution. So what is evolution? Is this week's big question. Let's make it little. So, evolution is a big word that gets thrown around a lot, and people use it all the time, but do you really know what it means? Evolution is a big, long process that takes millions and millions of years, and it's all about how organisms change, but what does that actually mean? Well, let me tell you. Charles Darwin's theory of evolution was explained in his book On the Origins of Species, which, as the title would suggest, was about the origins of different species of plants, animals and fungi. This was a long time ago, several hundred years ago, so people didn't really know what things like bacterial viruses were. In fact, they didn't even know about them at the time, and a lot of people, almost everyone, really thought fungi like mushrooms actually were plants, not realizing the big differences, which I'll probably talk about at some point in the future. Darwin spent a long time abroad on the Galapagos Islands and looked at birds a lot. He noticed that if two flocks of birds shared a food source, one of the flocks would eventually grow to have different shaped beaks so they could access different foods, meaning it was less likely that they'd have squabbles over the food source and they'd have more food available to them, to the flock, without having to share with the competition. This was Darwin's epiphany, if you like, and he soon postulated his theory of evolution. So, now you've learnt about the guy who worked out this theory and realised that I told you about him as a not so clever way of making this video longer. What actually is evolution? There are a lot of misconceptions about what evolution is. Some people think it's about how you become different as you grow up, changing as a person, spiritually speaking, emotionally speaking, and physically speaking. And others think that if someone is born with very different appearance and biology to their parents, like having blue skin, a tail, and being able to teleport, that's evolution. Thanks a lot, X-Men. Not. Anyway, these are misconceptions, which is a polite way of saying that they are very, very, very wrong ideas. They're completely wackadoo. The second one is a bit closer to the truth, but it's still a long way off, and the first one's just nonsense. First off, an organism is a very complicated machine. It's made of things like proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, and it does at least 8 things. These 8 things are moving, respiring, sensing their environment, controlling themselves, growing, reproducing, excreting waste, and nourishing themselves, otherwise known as Mrs. C. Grin. Side note, I once knew an old lady called Clara Grin. However, it didn't take long for us to realise she quite clearly wasn't herself, because she died. Second side note, I just made that story up as a joke, and it was awful. Anyway, the first organisms were single-celled organisms, so they were just individual little cells all by themselves floating around in the oceans. We're not sure how they got there, although there are lots of theories. No one scientifically really knows for sure. Anyway, for about 3 billion years, that's all life was. Lots of individual little cells that did stuff on their own floating around in the oceans. Then, about 1 billion years ago, evolution began. Now, evolution had been happening for a long time, of course, changing different single-celled organisms into other single-celled organisms, so they can survive and reproduce as their environment changes, bringing different levels of oxygen, different chemicals, different toxins into the environment. They had to change and evolve to compensate for this. But they only evolved into other single-celled organisms. They only started evolving into multicellular organisms about 1 billion or so years ago. First we had blind, spineless lumps of protoplasm floating around the oceans. Then they evolved into rather useless little fish that evolved in all kinds of cool and useful things like eyes to see with. These eventually evolved into amphibians, and they just sort of crawled out onto the lands and flopped about a bit. and at some point plants and fungi made their way from the seas as well, probably long before amphibians ever appeared. Then these amphibians evolved into things like reptiles and little mammals, and these reptiles evolved into snakes and lizards and dinosaurs, and the mammals evolved into things like mammoths and monkeys and apes like us. Then most of the dinosaurs were wiped out in what's called an extinction level event. Extinction is kind of like cutting off a lot of branches on the tree of evolution. More will still keep growing. Then, what was left of the dinosaurs evolved into the feathery little biscuits we know as birds. For example, we believe that ostriches were evolved from the most famous dinosaur of all, the T-Rex, and that one of the almost equally savage and terrifying monsters, thanks to that amazing straight at Dino Fest Jurassic Park, the Velociraptor, evolved into beady-eyed little beasts your chicken McNuggets were made from. So when you eat chicken, you eat the descendants of the terrifying Velociraptors. Back to the mammals, the apes evolved bigger brains and evolved things like Australopithecus africanus, which evolved into its own genius, Homo, which doesn't mean it's gay, just to be clear, like Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens neanderthalis, and finally all you beautiful Homo sapiens sapiens. So, evolution is basically how small changes between a child and its parent lead to entirely different species over millions and millions of years. One example is how the famously terrifying monsters of the past, the Velociraptors, went from predator to prey to chicken to your food. So, to finish this video off, here's a short clip from the video Evolution of Man. I'm Rocket from the Big Questions Made Little. Enjoy.